Smell is the first thing that assaults me whenever memory decides to visit me uninvited. It's not the smell of gunpowder, which we learned to breathe as if it were air, nor the smell of burnt metal, which clung to our clothes. It was a sweet, almost sickening smell of wet earth mixed with something my young soldier's mind refused to name, but which my body instinctively recognized as the odor of death itself. That morning, the fog over the Ardennes fields was so dense it felt like a curtain of damp grey wool, smothering the world. The silence was what frightened me most. In war, silence is never peace. It's the beast's deep breath before it pounces. We had been entrenched for days, our bones cold and hunger gnawing at our stomachs in a way that felt like an animal trying to escape from within us. We ate snow to stave off thirst and shared a hard biscuit between 3 men, scraping the crumbs off with the tip of our bayonet so as not to lose a single grain. I remember looking at the hands of my companion, Jimmy, a boy from Alabama barely old enough to shave, and seeing how blue his skin cracked from the cold. He smiled at me, a tremulous smile that didn't reach his frightened eye, and said something about the roast turkey his mother would make next Christmas, as if believing in that could warm up. Then the world exploded. There was no warning, no distant whistle of an approaching, just a flash of white and a sound that came from no specific direction, but from everywhere at once, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. I was thrown backward with an immense force, like a giant hand crushing me against the frozen earthen wall of the tren. The air was knocked from my lungs, and for an instant everything went white and silent. When my hearing returned, it was a constant, high-pitched buzzing sound, and the world around me was a hell of screams and fire. The snow, once pure white, was now stained red and black. Trees that once stood like silent sentinels were now charred stumps, spewing smoke into the grey sky. And the smell, that sweet smell, was everywhere, thick, suffocating, permeating every ounce of air I desperately tried to draw into my burning lung. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. I looked to the side and saw what was left of Jimmy. His mother's Christmas turkey would never be roasted. In that moment, amidst the chaos, the fire, and the screams of men I knew, men with whom I shared my bread and my hopes, I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I felt only a cold, utter emptiness, a terrible understanding that the world as I knew it was gone forever. The sky darkened, and within seconds, the world round me turned to fire, and I was but a ghost watching my own funeral, a spectre lost amidst the carnage that, even after so many years, still burns on my eyelids every time I close my eyes to sleep. War isn't about heroes and villains. It's about the sound a body makes as it's ripped in half and the silence that follows. And that silence, believe me, is the loudest thing a man can hear. My name is Frank Miller, and today I'm just an old man with hands stained by time and a back bent by the weight of memories I never asked to carry. When people see me sitting on the porch, my wool blanket draped over my knees, even in the heat of summer, they see a grandfather, perhaps a great-grandfather. They see a man who lived a long life. What they don't see is the 19-year-old boy who still shivers inside me, a boy trapped forever in the frozen snow of the Ardennes. Before I was Private Miller, ID number 3588971, I was just Frank, son of John and Sarah Miller, from a small rural town in the heart of Ohio. Our life was marked by the rhythm of the earth. The smell I knew wasn't that of death, but that of the damp soil in spring, when my father and I plowed it behind our old mule, Bessie. The sound that woke me wasn't artillery, but the rooster crowing and the sizzling of bacon my mother was frying in the cast-iron skillet. Our house was simple, white clapboard, with a creaky porch and a door that never needed locking. My biggest worry back then was whether the corn harvest would be good enough for me to finally buy that silver ring for Eleanor, the girl who lived down the road. I remember her hair, as blonde as dry corn at the end of summer, and the way she laughed, throwing her head back, as if there were no evil in the world. We'd sit by the creek, our feet in the cool water, and make simple plan. We'd get married, take over my parents, have children who would run through those same fields. The war was a distant thing, a rumble on the radio we heard at night, deep voices talking about places with names we could barely pronounce, Poland, France, Pearl Harbor. It felt like another world, a bad movie that had nothing to do with us. But then war came knocking on our door. Suddenly, being an Ohio farmer was no longer enough. The country was calling, and boys my age, one by one, enlisted. There was a fervor, a sense of duty that was impossible to ignore. Wearing that uniform for the first time made me feel taller, stronger. I wasn't just Frank anymore. I was a soldier in the United States Army. I remember the day I left. My mother tried to be strong, but I could see the glint of tears in her eyes. My father gave me an awkward hug, tighter than any he'd ever given, and whispered in my ear, "Just come home, son." Eleanor gave me a small picture of which I kept in the breast pocket of my tunic, over my heart. That small piece of cardboard became my talisman, my reminder of a world where silence meant peace. I was sent to the 106th Infantry Division. We were called the Golden Line Cubs. Most of us were just that, puppy, green kids, many straight out of high school, who had never seen anything beyond their hometown. We were dropped into what the generals called the Ghost Sector, a supposedly quiet area on the Belgian-German border. A break, they said, a chance to acclimate to the European climate before the real action began. The weather was its own entity, an invisible, relentless enemy. The cold was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was a damp chill that penetrated the many layers of clothing we wore, settled into our bones, and never left. The forest was dense and dark, with pine trees so tall they seemed to scrape against the low, gray sky. The world was made of shades of dark green, white, and gray. Daily life was a routine of boredom and fear. We stood guard, dug trenches in the frozen earth, cleaned our weapons with numb fingers, and talked about home. We talked about food. Oh, how we talked about food. We described in excruciating detail the burgers, the apple pies, the milkshake. We talked about girls, about cars, about what we would do when it was all over. Each man clung to an image, a dream, a memory. Mine was the creaking pork, the smell of my mother's bread, and Eleanor's smile. This was the world I was defending, a world of simplicity, warmth. Little did I know that to survive the hell that was to come, I would have to forget that world ever existed. The first time the war broke me inside wasn't with a bullet or an explosion. It was with the silence and the cold. It happened a few weeks before the hell I described, when our innocence was still a thin shell, about to shatter. We were assigned, myself and 5 other young men, to man a small forward observation post, a rough wooden bunker that barely protected us from the biting wind that blew through the trees. The task seemed simple: observe and report any movement. The sergeant patted us on the back, forced a smile, and said it was a good chance to feel the terrain without too much danger. The danger, we realized too late, didn't come solely from the enemy. It came from our own arrogance, our ignorance. We were starving. The food we were given was K-ration, waxed cardboard boxes filled with rock-hard cookies, a bar of dark chocolate that felt more like wax, and coffee grounds that, mixed with melted snow, resulted in a warm, inedible. But that was all we had. I remember David, a kid from Boston who talked endlessly about how he was going to open a book, saving his ration of chocolate. He would wrap it in a cloth and keep it in the inside pocket of his jacket, saying it was for a real emergency. To us, every day felt like an emergency, but we admired his discipline. On the 3rd night, the snow began to fall harder, muffling all sound. The world was reduced to the small circle of yellow light from our flashlight and the howl of the wind. That's when they came. We heard nothing, absolutely nothing. One of them, a specter of white against the snow, simply appeared at the entrance to the bunker. His face was young, but his eyes were ancient, empty of all emotion. He didn't shout, didn't threaten us. He simply raised his rifle, an MP40, and the gesture was enough. Within seconds, 3 more appeared, moving with a silent, terrifying efficiency that paralyzed. We were 6 American boys with weapons we barely knew how to use properly, and they were professional hunters. The humiliation was the worst. They didn't see us as soldiers. They saw us as a nuisance. One of them, with a sneer, walked slowly among us. With the tip of his gun, he pointed at our backpack. We understood the order without a word being spoken. We emptied everything on the ground. They took our food. All of it. They took the cans of meat, the cookies, the coffee. The soldier searching us stopped in front of David. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small cloth bundle. David protested. A low sound, a moan of no, please. The German unwrapped the chocolate, looked at David with icy contempt, broke the bar in half and ate it slowly, chewing with his mouth. Then he threw the empty cloth in David's face. They didn't just want our supplies, they wanted our dignity. They took our extra blanket, the dry socks we treasured, and from one of the boys, they took his boots, leaving him barefoot in the dirty snow, his feet turning purple within seconds. Before they left, one of them turned and said something in German, the only phrase of the night. Later, a translator told us what it meant. Go back to your mothers, children. And then they disappeared, as silently as they had appeared. The silence they left behind was heavy, suffocating. We were alive, yes, but something inside us had been stolen. Shame was a physical illness. We felt cold, we felt hungry, but above all, we felt an overwhelming helplessness. We were the mighty American soldiers, the liberators of Europe, and we had been treated like delinquent children by a handful of enemy soldiers who hadn't even bothered to consider us a threat. David cried, not for the chocolate, but for what it represented. It was the shattering of the last illusion that we had any control, any power. The walk back to the main camp was the longest of my life. We carried the bootless boy, taking turn, while our own feet froze. With every step, the German's words echoed in my mind. Go back to your mothers, children. Maybe he was right. We weren't soldiers. We were just farm boys and clerks, playing war in a place we didn't understand, against an enemy who despised. That night taught me the hardest lesson of war. Pain comes not only from the wounded body, but from the humiliated soul. The hunger in my stomach was terrible, the cold in my bones unbearable, but the bitter taste of shame, that was a poison that would stay with us for a long, long time. The humiliation was just the appetizer. The devil's feast was yet to be served, and we were the main course. After that encounter with the German patrol, the ghost sector began to awaken, like a sleepy animal suddenly deciding it's hungry. The change wasn't immediate. It was a subtle, malignant crescendo. It began with the sound. At first, it was a distant murmur on the horizon, a low, steady thunder we could barely distinguish from the wind. We grew accustomed to it, like someone living near a train line grows accustomed to the rumble of passing train. But day by day, the sound grew closer. The murmur became a roar. The roar became a rumble that made the ground beneath our feet vibrate slightly. We learned the language of death that traveled through the air. There was the high-pitched, rising whistle of mortar fire, which we called moaning minis, a sound that seemed to tear through the sky before the deafening explosion that spewed shrapnel in every direction. There was the zee-zee-zee-zee crack, the distinctive sound of German artillery 88, a sonic whip that meant the shell was traveling faster than sound. You heard the explosion before you heard the shell come. If you heard it, you were safe. If not, it was too late. Silence became our most precious and rare possession. In the brief moments of calm, our ears rang, trying to readjust to a world without explosion. In those moments, we heard the sounds that the noise of war had drowned out. The groan of a wounded man a few meters away, the low cry of a boy who couldn't take it anymore, or the most frightening sound of all, the sound of our own labored breathing, reminding us that we were still alive, for now. After the sound came the transformation of the landscape. The Ardennes forest, which had once seemed majestic in its snowy covering, began to resemble a mutilated corpse. The trees, which had offered us scant cover, were now our enemies. The explosions transformed them into barbed wooden spears that flew through the air, more lethal than many shrapnel. The ground, once a pristine white carpet, became a lunar landscape of black, muddy craters filled with icy water, bodies that the snow tried, as if nature itself were ashamed of what we were doing. War has a particular smell, a nauseating mixture that sticks to the back of your throat and never leaves. It's the smell of crushed pine mixed with the acrid odor of Godai. It's the warm, metallic smell of fresh blood spilled on the snow. It was the stench of burnt diesel from destroyed tanks. Worst of all, the sweet, rancid smell of decaying human flesh an odor the cold couldn't completely suppress. We smelled of war. Our clothes, our hair, our skin, everything was impregnated with this perfume of hell. Horror became our routine. We woke to the ground shaking, ate our cold rations to the sound of machine guns, and slept in holes dug in the frozen earth, praying an explosion would unbury us alive. Death ceased to be an abstract concept and became a constant, casual presence. We watched men we'd shared a joke with 5 minutes earlier reduced to a red smear in the snow. We watched tanks, those seemingly invincible steel beasts, be opened like sardine can, revealing a charred interior. One day, one of our reconnaissance planes was shot down overhead. We watched the pilot parachute out, his small white dot against the gray sky. For a moment, we all held our breath, cheering him on. But then, enemy fighters swooped in like hawks and machine-gunned the helpless man as he slowly floated toward the ground. We watched his body sway, inert, before disappearing into the trees. In that moment, I understood there were no rules, no honor. There was only survival and killing. We ourselves had changed. The young, hopeful faces that had arrived in Europe were now masks of filth and exhaustion. Our sunken eyes acquired what they called the 1,000-yard stare, a vacant stare that focused on nothing nearby but seemed lost in some horrible distance. Constant fear was an electric current coursing through our bodies, making us irritable, ready to explode at the slightest thing. We stopped talking about the future, about our home, about our girl. Talking about it was too painful, like peering into a lost paradise from a deep, dark well. I wonder, as I tell this, if words truly do justice to these moments. If you, listening, can feel even a hint of what we felt, the tremor in our chest that never ceases, the cold that is not just winter, but the soul, share this story, perhaps, so that others may try to understand what should never be forgotten and the price so many of us pay in silence. The escalation reached its peak in the early morning hours of December 16. The artillery barrage that struck us was unlike anything we had ever experienced. It was a deluge of fire and steel. The entire world transformed into sound and fury. The earth heaved in waves, like a stormy sea. Trees cracked and fell like matchsticks. Inside our trenches, we were like rats in a box being shaken by a furious giant. Men screamed, prayed, cried, and vomited in sheer terror. I huddled deep in my hole, my hands over my head, convinced that every second would be my last. I didn't think of God. I didn't think of my family. My mind was completely blank, occupied only by a single, primal instinct to survive the next second. When the barrage finally subsided, an unreal silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded. And it was in this silence that we heard a new sound, the metallic, creaking sound of hundreds of tank tracks approaching in the darkness, accompanied by shouts in a language not. The true offensive had begun. The ghost sector had revealed itself as the spearhead of Hitler's last, desperate gamble. And we, the Golden Lion Cubs, the inexperienced boys, were well in the way. The horror was no longer escalating. It had arrived at our gate, with steel teeth and an insatiable appetite. Amidst the pandemonium that history books now call the Battle of the Bulge, the war ceased to be about nations or strategy. It shrank, becoming a terribly personal thing. The world, for me, shrank to a snow-covered patch of forest, a few feet of frozen ground, and the face of my best friend. Sam wasn't like the others. He was from Chicago, the son of a teacher, and he always carried a pocketbook of poems, its pages worn and damp. He was quiet, gentle, and saw beauty in places where we saw only desolation. He showed me how frost formed intricate patterns on pine needles, or how the sun, for a brief moment at dusk, painted the snow a rosy. He reminded me that there was a world beyond the mud and blood. That night, when the barrage ceased and the tanks began to advance, our defense line disintegrated. It wasn't a retreat. It was a chaotic rout. The order was simple and brutal. Retreat to est. Every man for himself. Every man for himself. 3 words that shattered all bonds of camaraderie, reducing us to frightened animals racing for survival. Sam and I stayed together, running low among the exploding trees, the sound of German machine guns hunting us in the dark. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and filled with scream. We ran for perhaps 10 minutes, which felt like 10 years, when Sam suddenly let out a low groan and fell face down in the snow. For a second, I thought he'd trip. I turned and saw him struggling to get up, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. That's when I saw the dark stain spreading rapidly on his pant, melting the snow beneath him. A burst of machine gun fire had found him. Panic froze my spine, but the image of Sam's face, contorted with pain but still looking at me with confidence, forced me to act. "Help me, Frank," he whispered, his voice sweet. I threw myself beside him, ripped open his pant leg, and saw the wow. The bone was shattered. It was a mass of blood, muscle, and bone fragment. There was nothing I could do. Not there, not in the middle of hell. But I couldn't leave him. Never. He was my friend. I slung his arm round my shoulders and dragged him. Each step was agony. He weighed a ton, and my feet sank into the soft snow. He tried to help, leaning on his good leg, but the pain was so bad he passed out and came to, murmuring his little sister's name, Anna. Anna. Explosions continued round us, throwing dirt and snow over us. The sound of tanks grew closer. I could hear German soldiers shouting orders to each other. They were surrounding us. After about 50 meters, I collapsed, exhausted, with Sam on. My whole body was shaking, not just from the cold, but from exertion and fear. "Frank," he said, his voice now a breath. "Frank, you have to go." "Shut up, Sam," I replied, panting. "We're getting out of here." "No, we're not," he said, and for the first time, I saw the desperation in his eye. "Look at me, Frank, I'm done. If you stay, they'll get us both. You have to go. I'm not leaving you." I screamed, more to myself than to him. "I promised your mother I'd take care of you." He smiled, a sad, bloody smile. "You did. You're my brother, Frank. That's why you have to leave me. Go. Live. Tell them, tell Anna I loved her." He began to push me with what little strength he had left. "Go, now." A nearby explosion showered us with debris. As the smoke cleared, I saw a group of figures in grey uniforms approaching, less than 30 meters away. It was the end. Sam saw where I was looking. His face became a mask of determination. "Give me your gun, Frank," he said, his voice firm. I hesitated, uncomprehending. "Give me your gun," he insisted. Shocked, I handed him my M1 rifle. He scrambled to his feet, propping himself up on one elbow, and aimed toward the advancing soldier. "Now run," he ordered. "I'll give you cover. Run and don't look back, promise." Hot tears streamed down my frozen face. I couldn't move. "Promise, Frank," he shouted, with a strength I hadn't known he still possessed. I shook my head, sobbing. "Run." He began firing. The sound of M1 gunfire echoed through the forest, and I saw one of the Germans fall. They threw themselves to the ground and responded with a burst of machine gun fire that ripped chunks out of the tree next to my head. That was the push I needed. My survival instinct, my friend's final order, all combined, making me turn and run. I ran like I'd never run before in my life. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was the sound of Sam's rifle firing once, twice, 3 times more. And then the overwhelming sound of dozens of enemy weapons responding at once, a sound that seemed to tear my friend's body into 1,000 pieces. And then silence. I kept running, blinded by tears and fear, until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I fell into the snow, many meters away, and it was only then that I allowed myself to look back. There was nothing left to see, only the dark forest, the falling snow, and the sound of war continuing its relentless march. I left him. I ran while he died for me. This is the scene that haunts me. Not the explosion, not the tank, not the enemy. It's Sam's face, begging me to live. It's the sound of his last shot. It's the weight of my survival, but with his sacrifice. Every night, when I close my eyes, I'm back in that forest. I feel his weight on my shoulders, hear his voice telling me to run, and I'm forced to abandon him, again and again, for all eternity. I survived the war, yes, but a part of me died there, in that blood-stained snow, beside my brother. After abandoning Sam, I became a ghost. I ran aimlessly through the dark. I see Farah, driven only by the echo of his last scream and the animal instinct to flee from danger. For hours, or perhaps a whole day, time lost all meaning. I wandered that white hell, alone. The world was a blur of snow, black trees, and the distant sound of battle. Guilt gnawed at me, a wound deeper than any shrapnel could inflict. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper my name with his voice. Coward. I was about to give up, to simply lie down in the snow and let the cold take me, when I encountered others like him. There were a dozen men, rags from different units, all separated from their platoon, all with the same 1,000-yard stare. They had barricaded themselves in a small stone chapel in the middle of a clearing, near a vital crossroads the Germans needed to take. The place was called, ironically, Crossroads of Hope, led by a sergeant from the 28th Division, a grizzled, tough man named McCall. They decided this would be their last. "We're not going anywhere," McCall said hoarsely. "If we're going to die, we're going to die here, taking as many of them with us as we can." There was a madness in their determination, strangely. Gave me purpose. Dying with purpose seemed better than dying alone in the snow. The chapel was our fortress and our potential grave. The thick stone walls offered some protection, and the stained glass windows, long since shattered, served as perfect arrow slits. We had little ammunition, even less food, and only a few first aid. What we had in abundance was fear. The attack began at dawn on the second day. First came the artillery. The explosions moved toward us, a line of invisible giants stomping the earth, each step closer. The small chapel shook as if it were alive, and stone dust fell from the ceiling onto us, covering us with a grey shroud. When the barrage stopped, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. And then we saw them, emerging from the tree line. First the infantry, hundreds of them, moving methodically through the snow. And behind them, the steel beasts, 3 Panzer tanks, their black crosses painted on their side, advancing like relentless predators. Sergeant McCall shouted the order, "Hold fire until they reach the oak. Make every bullet count." Time seemed to slow. I could hear my own breathing, feel the blood pounding in my ears. My hand, sweaty despite the freezing cold, gripped my rifle so tightly my knuckles were white. The world narrowed to the small broken window through which I aimed. As the first German stepped into the clearing, McCall shouted fire. The chapel erupted in pandemonium of sound and fury. Our machine guns spat death, mowing down the first ranks of soldiers. My rifle bounced on my shoulder with each shot, and I wasn't aiming at faces, only at grey shapes moving against the white snow. For a moment, it seemed we might stop them, but they were like a tide. For every one that fell, 2 more took their place. And then the tanks opened fire. The sound of a panzer cannon firing at close range is indescribable. It's a force of nature, an explosion that can't just be heard, but felt in every bone, every organ of the body. The first shell hit the bell tower, which exploded in a shower of stone and wood. The second tore a gigantic hole in the side wall, throwing 3 of our men into the air like rag dolls. The air filled with dust, screams, and the smell of ozone. The battle became claustrophobic chaos. The Germans were at the door. Sergeant McCall, with a bazooka, managed to immobilize one of the tanks, but was cut in half by another Panzer's machine gun before he could even celebrate. The leadership was gone. The plan was gone. Only instinct remained. They were in. German soldiers, with their steel helmets and empty eyes, began to pour through the hole in the wall. The fighting became intimate, brutal, and desperate. My M1's ammunition ran out. I used it like a club, striking a soldier who lunged at me. We fell to the stone floor, rolling among the bodies of my comrades. He was strong, and his fingers closed round my neck, suffocating. I looked into his eyes and saw no hatred. I saw the same terror he probably saw in mine. My vision began to dim. My hand, desperately groping on the floor, found something heavy and cold, one of the bronze candlesticks from the altar. With the last ounce of strength I had, I lifted it and struck him in the side of the head. The sound was a wet, horrible crack. The grip on my neck loosened. I pushed him aside and stood, gasping, covered in blood, his and mine. That was when the last tank pulled into position right in front of the main entrance. We knew what was coming. It was the end. I huddled behind an overturned wooden bench, closed my eyes, and thought of Sam. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I waited for the explosion that would send me into the darkness, but it didn't come. Instead, I heard a series of explosions outside, different from any we'd heard before. And then, screams, more screams in German, but this time they were of panic. Cautiously, I peered over the bench. Through the hole in the wall, I saw the impossible. American fighter jets, P-47 Thunderbolt, emerging from the grey sky like avenging angels, their .50 caliber machine guns tearing through the German infantry, their rockets blasting the two remaining tanks into fireball. The sky, which had been cloudy for weeks, had briefly opened, allowing air support to come to our aid. The tide had turned, not by us, but by a stroke of fate. The German attack had fizzled out. The soldiers who hadn't been killed retreated to the safety of the forest, leaving behind a field of dead and burning vehicles. Inside the chapel, the silence fell like a physical weight. There were perhaps 5 of us, wounded, in shock, surrounded by the bodies of our comrades and enemies. The stone floor was slick with blood, smoke stung of eyes. I looked down at my hands, trembling and bloody. I had survived, but while relief should have flooded me, all I felt was a deep, icy emptiness. I had lived through the worst moment of my life, stared death in the face, and the only question I could ask myself was why? Why me, and not Sam? Why me, and not Sergeant McCall? In that deafening silence, amidst the carnage, I understood that survival wasn't a victory. It was a sentence. After abandoning Sam, I became a ghost. I ran aimlessly through the dark, icy forest, driven only by the echo of his last scream and the animal instinct to flee from danger. For hours, or perhaps a whole day, time lost all meaning. I wandered that white hell, alone. The world was a blur of snow, black trees, and the distant sound of battle. Guilt gnawed at me, a wound deeper than any shrapnel could inflict. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper my name with his voice. Coward. I was about to give up, to simply lie down in the snow and let the cold take me, when I encountered others like. There were a dozen men, rags from different units, all separated from their platoon, all with the same 1,000-yard stare. They had barricaded themselves in a small stone chapel in the middle of a clearing, near a vital crossroads the Germans needed to take. The place was called, ironically, Crossroads of Hope, led by a sergeant from the 28th Division, a grizzled, tough man named McCall. They decided this would be their last. "We're not going anywhere," McCall said hoarsely. "If we're going to die, we're going to die here, taking as many of them with us as we can." There was a madness in their determination, strangely, gave me purpose. Dying with purpose seemed better than dying alone in the snow. The chapel was our fortress and our potential grave. The thick stone walls offered some protection, and the stained glass windows, long since shattered, served as perfect arrow slits. We had little ammunition, even less food, and only a few first aid. What we had in abundance was fear. The attack began at dawn on the second day. First came the artillery. The explosions moved toward us, a line of invisible giants stomping the earth, step closer. The small chapel shook as if it were alive, and stone dust fell from the ceiling onto us, covering us with a grey shroud. When the barrage stopped, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. And then we saw them, emerging from the tree line. First the infantry, hundreds of them, moving methodically through the snow. And behind them, the steel beasts, 3 panzer tanks, their black crosses painted on their side, advancing like relentless predators. Sergeant McCall shouted the order, "Hold fire until they reach the open. Make every bullet count." Time seemed to slow. I could hear my own breathing, feel the blood pounding in my ears. My hand, sweaty despite the freezing cold, gripped my rifle so tightly my knuckles were white. The world narrowed to the small broken window through which I aimed. As the first German stepped into the clearing, McCall shouted fire. The chapel erupted in pandemonium of sound and fury. Our machine guns spat death, mowing down the first ranks of soldiers. My rifle bounced on my shoulder with each shot, and I wasn't aiming at faces, only at grey shapes moving against the white snow. For a moment, it seemed we might stop them, but they were like a tide, For every one that fell, two more took their place. And then the tanks opened fire. The sound of a panzer cannon firing at close range is indescribable. It's a force of nature, an explosion that can't just be heard, but felt in every bone, every organ of the body. The first shell hit the bell tower, which exploded in a shower of stone and wood. The second tore a gigantic hole in the side wall, throwing 3 of our men into the air like ragdoll. The air filled with dust, screams, and the smell of ozone. The battle became claustrophobic chaos. The Germans were at the door. Sergeant McCall, with a bazooka, managed to immobilize one of the tanks, but was cut in half by another Panzer's machine gun before he could even celebrate. The leadership was gone. The plan was gone. Only instinct remained. They were in. German soldiers, with their steel helmets and empty eyes, began to pour through the hole in the wall. The fighting became intimate, brutal, and desperate. My M1's ammunition ran out. I used it like a club, striking a soldier who lunged at me. We fell to the stone floor, rolling among the bodies of my comrade. He was strong, and his fingers closed round my neck, suffocating. I looked into his eyes and saw no hatred. I saw the same terror he probably saw in mine. My vision began to dim. My hand, desperately groping on the floor, found something heavy and cold, one of the bronze candlesticks from the altar. With the last ounce of strength I had, I lifted it and struck him in the side of the head. The sound was a wet, horrible crack. The grip on my neck loosened. I pushed him aside and stood, gasping, covered in blood, his and mine. That was when the last tank positioned itself right in front of the main entrance. We knew what was coming. It was the end. I huddled behind an overturned wooden bench, closed my eyes, and thought of Sam. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I waited for the explosion that would send me into the darkness, but it didn't come. Instead, I heard a series of explosions outside, different from any we'd heard before. And then, screams, more screams in German, but this time they were of panic. Cautiously, I peered over the bend. Through the hole in the wall, I saw the impossible. American fighter, P-47 Thunderbolt, emerging from the grey sky like avenging angel. Their .50 caliber machine guns tearing through the German infantry, and their rockets blasting the 2 remaining tanks into fireballs. The sky, which had been cloudy for weeks, had briefly opened, allowing air support to come to our aid. The tide had turned, not but by a stroke of fate. The German attack had fizzled out. The soldiers who hadn't been killed retreated to the safety of the forest, leaving behind a field of dead and burning vehicles. Inside the chapel, the silence fell like a physical weight. There were perhaps 5 of us, wounded, in shock, surrounded by the bodies of our comrades and enemies. The stone floor was slick with blood. Smoke stung our eyes. I looked down at my hand, trembling and bloody. I had survived, but while relief should have flooded me, all I felt was a deep, icy emptiness. I had lived through the worst moment of my life, stared death in the face, and the only question I could ask myself was why? Why me, and not Sam? Why me, and not Sergeant McCall? In that deafening silence, amidst the carnage, I understood that survival wasn't a victory. It was a sentence. Eventually, we were found. What remained of us in the chapel was rescued by a patrol of Sherman tanks a few days later. We were taken to a field where the smell of antiseptic barely masked the stench of gangrene and despair. My body was wounded in ways I hadn't even noticed: small cut, bruises, the beginnings of frostbite on my feet, but they were superficial wounds. The real injuries, the ones that would stay with me for the rest of my life, were invisible. No one could see them, but I felt them every moment. I feel them now, as the afternoon sun warms my old bone. I returned home. I received a medal, a pat on the back, and a discharge. I tried to resume the life I had left behind. I married Eleanor. I took over my father's farm. I had children, then grandchildren, who now run through these same fields where I dreamed of a simple future. For all intents and purpose, I was a success, a hero who returned from war and built a good life. But that's just the story people see. The truth is much more complicated. For a long time, I searched for meaning in it all. I tried to find a noble lesson, a grand moral that justified the suffering, that gave purpose to the deaths of men like I read books, watched movies, listened to politicians' speeches. They spoke of heroism, of sacrifice for freedom, of the triumph of good over evil. And though a part of me knew we were fighting for a just cause, those words rang hollow, empty. They didn't fit with the sound of a bronze candlestick crushing a man's skull, nor the sight of a friend begging you to let him die alone in the snow. The true lesson the war taught me wasn't in any history book. It took me decades to understand it, decades living with the ghosts I brought with me from that forest. The catharsis, my moral, is this: war doesn't teach you to love your country. It teaches you to love life in its simplest, most fragile. Before the war, I took everything for granted. Food on the table, a roof over my head, the sunlight. It was just the way the world worked. But after I went hungry, slept in freezing hole, thought I'd never see the sunrise again, every little thing became a miracle. The taste of hot coffee in the morning isn't just coffee. It's the warmth my friends never felt again. The sound of my grandchildren's laughter isn't just joy. It's the music that was silenced in so many 19-year-olds. The silence of the night in the field isn't just stillness. It's the peace Sam gave his life so I could have it. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. I saw the bravest men I ever knew cry in terror in their trenches. True courage, the courage that mattered, was the human decency that survived in the midst of hell. He was the soldier sharing his last biscuit. He was the medic crawling under fire to reach a wounded man. He was Sam, giving me his last seconds so I could have a whole life. War taught me that we are all terribly fragile. We are just skin, bone, and a beating heart. And all of that can be undone in the blink of an eye by the passage of a small piece of metal. And at the same time, I learned that within that fragility lies incredible strength. The strength to keep walking when your legs give out. The strength to drag a friend. The strength to hold a dying man's hand and lie to him, telling him everything will be okay. The burden I carry is not just sadness. It is the weight of responsibility. I survive, so I have a duty to remember. I remember them not as heroes in a parade, but as they were, scared boys who told bad jokes, who missed their mothers, who dreamed of returning home. I live the life they couldn't live. Every sunrise I see for them. Every time I hug my family, I hug for them. It's not a matter of happiness, but of gratitude, a painful and profound gratitude, the intimate lesson. The moral that war left me with is that the greatest victory is not defeating an enemy, but surviving the battle with a shred of humanity intact. It is staring into the abyss of human savagery and, instead of becoming a monster, choosing to desperately cling to the small things that make us human. Compassion, loyalty, memory. I carry my scars, visible and invisible, not as a sign of weakness, but as a map of the journey that taught me the true value of a single, precious breath of. The sun is setting now, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. It's a beautiful, peaceful sight. My grandchildren are laughing inside. The smell of my wife's dinner wafts through the door. This is the life I've been given, the prize for my survival, and I'm grateful for it, every second of it. But there's a truth no one sees me carry, a truth that hides behind my tired smiles and my silence. Sometime, when the wind blows just right through the cornfield, it sounds like the whistle of a distant mortar. On winter nights, when the snow covers everything in a silent white blanket, I look out the window and don't see my backyard in Ohio. I see the dark forests of the Ardennes. Almost instinctively, to see grey figures emerging from the shadows, they tell me the war ended over 50 years ago, that we won, that I'm safe. But how can you be safe when the battlefield is within you? How can the war be over when I still fight it every night, in the darkness of my room? I see Sam's face, not as it was in the happy moment, but as it was in that last second, his eyes begging me to run. I feel the weight of the bronze candlestick in my hand. I hear the silence of the chapel. People talk about moving on, about leaving the past behind. But some things cannot be left behind. They are part of who you are. They are the ink with which the rest of your life is written. I am not a hero. Heroes are those who never return, whose names are carved in cold stone in places their families may never visit. I am merely a survivor, a keeper of fading memory, a ghost of a war the world has already forgotten in its detail. That is why I tell this story. Not for myself, but for them, for the names behind the numbers, for the faces behind the uniform. If this memory touched you, don't let it die in silence. There are so many stories like mine, buried in old and weary hearts. Share this story, so that the echo of their voices and the weight of their sacrifices will never fade, so that, together, we can remember. Sometime, when I look at my reflection in the window, I don't see the old man. I see a 19-year-old boy, his eyes filled with a horror no age should know, shivering in the cold in a distant forest. And I wonder, did any part of me ever truly make it out of that snow?